Hi, everyone. Welcome to a panel on culture and its discontents. We have three great papers to hear about, and then Kate McNamara and I are going to offer some comments. And we're going to go, I guess, in the order in which the papers are listed in the APSA program. So first, we're going to have a paper by Kathy Jo Martin and Tom Chevalier, but Kathy Jo is going to present it about what we talk about when we talk about poverty. And then we're going to have Rachel Rydell and Gwyneth McClendon on From Pews to Politics, Using Sermons to Study Religion's Influence on Political Participation. Followed last, but certainly not least, by Keith Darden's paper on explaining the durability of national identities. So they will each speak again, and then we will have comments, and then hopefully you guys will have some questions and things to discuss. Thanks so much.
Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you so much to everybody in the audience. I know we're up against some rather difficult competitors, so when I saw the program, I thought, oh man, I hope some people show up to ours. But it's great to see that people are actually concerned about culture and interested in thinking about culture in new ways. So my work really started when I went to Denmark as a 17-year-old in many, many years ago. And I encountered a very strange phenomenon, which was that people talked about samfund all the time. And I didn't know what samfund was. I thought samfund was a person, that everyone was talking about taking care of samfund and nurturing samfund. I thought this must be a really important person. Well, it turns out samfund is the Danish word for society. And so I started thinking about, way back then at 17, how different Danes think about their society than Americans. And in some ways, this has informed a lot of the current study. I also have done published a recent paper in World Politics on culture and education systems in different countries. So if you're interested in that, you might take a look at that paper as well. So the main question on the board for Tom and I is, Tom and me, is what accounts for these really different approaches to welfare in different countries? Why do countries develop different welfare regimes? And I'm always struck by the fact that in Denmark, they passed all these what we might call workfare policies in the 90s, where they wanted to get people off welfare, they put them to work, they kicked them off passive welfare, and within about 6 months, and forced them to go into training programs or subsidized jobs. Those policies were passed very easily with a broad cross-class coalition, whereas in France, when they tried to suggest similar policies in the mid-2000s, young people took to the streets, and there was a vast outcry against it, including Tom Chevalier, my co-author, was out there kind of rallying against welfare changes. Now, these differences in welfare states also have historical antecedents. For example, you see the Danish state as early as the 18th century saying that municipalities had a responsibility to provide jobs to poor people, which was vastly different from Britain. Britain experimented with these policies in a few areas, but it didn't really catch on, and it was widely rejected that the state had this responsibility. In France, you have permissive attitudes toward begging for a very long time, whereas in Denmark and Britain, they banned begging early on. So we're trying to figure out why these countries develop such different approaches, and really why they develop such different approaches historically, even before the evolution of social class and political parties and employer associations and all the things that we think of as being important. And we say that there are really two crucial choices in social policy regimes. There are many, many welfare regime aspects, but two in particular are the question of agency, or responsibility for fixing the problem. And here you have the kind of bed bridge systems that you find in Scandinavia as well as in the Anglo countries where the state takes charge more, versus Bismarckian systems where it tends to be done through employers' organizations or the church or other non-state actors. And then the second dimension is the target for aid to beneficiaries. And here you see in some countries a kind of universal citizenship being the target for aid. This, of course, is in the Scandinavian countries and the Germanic countries where they have universal programs. In the Germanic countries, they're not all one program, but there's still an expectation of universal benefits versus target individual means-tested programs. So we ask where this comes from and try to figure out how this develops. So this is a slide that looks at different welfare regimes, the social democratic, liberal, and Christian democratic or Mediterranean. And you can see the agency in red on the vertical line and the pillar on the horizontal line. So you get, this is kind of a standard welfare state regime slide. Now, the usual explanations for these differences have to do with industrialization or strength of the labor movement. So industrialization, countries that industrialize earlier will move to provide social benefits to cover the risks of social risks associated with industrialization. Strength of labor movements, the kind of willingness of employers, associations to collaborate with labor and to provide benefits, or religion. And scholars often date these innovations from around 1900, when the social insurance initiatives really start developing, and that's kind of seen as the beginning of welfare states by many scholars. But we find that the differences go back far earlier to the 1700s and before. And we also think that these existing explanations are terrific, and they say a lot about agencies and people who are important in the movement. But what they're less good at saying is why the same actors, like labor parties, for example, have very different preferences across countries. The only one that really deals with early differences is religion, and I think this is a kind of a wonderful theory. At the same time, countries, the Anglican and Lutheran churches are fairly similar in Britain and the Nordic countries. There's a huge evangelical dissenter movement in Scandinavia, but the difference is that these evangelicals actually support social investments early on in a way that's very similar to the dominant Lutheran church. So we have this feeling that ideas sweep the world, but the implementation varies depending on culture, that ideas need to be interpreted, culture needs to be reinvented. So it makes sense to look at how culture is passed on from one generation to the next. And we choose to look at the cultural artifacts of literature and at authors as purveyors of cultural symbols and narratives. So how does culture matter? Well, there have been a lot of explanations drawing attention to culture that are terrific. Cox, Svalfers, Peterson, Kahl, Mano, and von Kirchbergen. But some of these explanations, especially the older American explanations a la Sam Huntington, tend to be rather essentialist and hard to verify empirically. So what we try to do is think about how writers and cultural artifacts of literature matter and how to measure these empirically. So writers get involved, first of all, as direct actors in policy debates. So I've been spending a lot of time recently looking at networks between authors and policymakers in Britain and Denmark, and they're incredibly close. And there's a huge role for authors in putting issues on the public agenda that weren't necessarily there before. In the 1790s, authors under authoritarian regimes argued extensively over public policy issues in their works, and really were one of the few sources of conveying non-state opinions to the governors. Secondly, writers shape the preferences of other actors, and there's a lot of evidence of how cognitive framing of social problems in literature matters to the framing of the social problems in legislation, in laws, etc. Authors also make emotional appeals that heighten attention to issues, and so Dickens fully understood that he was attacking child labor laws when he rewrote his novels, and said at one point that his novels were 20,000 times as effective as any work he might do as a journalist. But third, another way to look at culture is to think about cultural narratives. And if you think culture matters, then you should be able to observe broad differences in bodies of literature and the cultural narratives around poverty words. And we don't think these cultural narratives are all the same. We make an argument similar to Michelle Lamont's argument about repertoires of evaluation. She says that they're unevenly distributed across countries, and we feel that cultural symbols and narratives, Swindler's cultural toolkit, are also unevenly distributed across countries. So authors rework these symbols, values, and narratives for new challenges. It's not deterministic. Canons are constantly changing and evolving, but nonetheless, you should be able to observe differences. So we say in particular that if culture matters to social development, you should see cultural variations in depictions of poverty. And you should particularly see them along the two lines that we set out before. Cultural depictions of the targets or goals of poverty, whether they're for the individual or for a broader society, a kind of universal group. Cultural depictions of the agents to solve poverty, whether it should be the state or non-state actors such as the church, private groups, or employers, unions, etc. And so what we predict is that different welfare regimes should have associated with poverty words different words. So the social democratic regime should include words about state, society, skills, social investments. The liberal regime should have regulation, individuals, feelings, charity, families. And the social Christian democratic or Mediterranean regime should be individuals, feelings, children, charity, and religion. It's more we think of France as more Mediterranean than Christian democratic, I should say here. So our methods are to take these large corpora of texts, and we have 500 and actually 62 in Britain, 521 in Denmark, and 500 in France. These are works that we have taken from online sources of great writers and works in these countries. We calculate word frequencies and do unsupervised topic modeling, and then we also do brief case studies. So I'm not going to do this slide. Just show that in terms of all poverty words, the words in, you can see these different countries. So in Denmark, this is the dark green. France is the center one, and Britain is the light green. But what I really want to do is get to the differences in words. So in Denmark, we expect it to be strong on social investment going way back, strong on society, the state, etc. Few family words, little charity words. And you can see this in this slide. So the Danish line is the dark green line. And you can see that this is references to society words, and you can see that society words are really important in Denmark. They're actually statistically significantly more important there than in the other countries. France is the red one, and Britain is the light blue one, and you have fewer references to society words in these countries. Now this is the state. Again, Denmark, the dark green is, the light green is much more important than the other countries. Religion, the Danish National Church is really involved in the poverty project, and this was a little bit different from what we might have expected, and I can go back to that in the discussion. This slide I just love, because these are words about capacities and social investment and skills, and Denmark is the turquoise word, so going way back to 1680 to 1760, Denmark has many, many, many more words in snippets of poverty, texts around poverty, than the other two countries. So social investment has been a central theme in Scandinavia for a very long time. Now in Christian democratic or Mediterranean France, you get Christian, these are charity words, and Britain and France have lots of charity words, the dark green and the light green. Denmark in blue has almost no charity words at all. And if you know something about the Danish welfare state, they don't really talk in terms of charity much. There's very little giving in these countries' private charity. Again, families who are connected to kind of individual pleas are much more important in the other two countries than in Denmark, which is the lime green. The liberal welfare states, you would expect high levels of individualism in France and Britain, and again, you get much higher levels in France and Britain than in Denmark, which is the blue at the bottom. Feeling words which are related to individuals, Britain in particular has very high levels here. Social class is actually a big issue in Britain, which is the dark blue. It's high in Denmark, which is the green at the beginning, but sort of falls out of the calculus until the last period. So in conclusion, I just want to draw your attention to a couple of points. First of all, it does seem that welfare states have really different associations going way back to the 1700s. They have different contemporary associations, so we think about social investment in social democratic countries and private charity in liberal countries, and in fact, those associations go way back to this early period. And we think that these associations really are related to a cultural dimension. So our work reveals the deep historical roots of this dimension. We suggest that countries face similar challenges, but the writers and the reworking of symbols, et cetera, narratives help to kind of place these challenges in a different context. Now, this has a lot of implications, and the first implication is for social democracy itself. So a lot of the literature on social democracy has made arguments about the strength of the working class, and what our work suggests is that it has more to do with building a strong society than redistribution among groups and one group winning over another group, or even a drive for equality. These guys weren't particularly interested in equality at the beginning of the 1700s. And I think this emphasis on society over equality has been a major reason why the Scandinavian welfare states have developed so robustly. It also has implications for social class development, because we think that culture informs preferences, and in this way, culture shapes class cleavages. The context of people's preferences matters a lot. It also has implications for arguments about the power of ideas. We think ideas are important. Ideas are very helpful in explaining why we make transitions from one moment to the next in terms of our approach to welfare. So active labor market policies swept the world in the 90s, and everybody adopted various forms of it. At the same time, culture really shapes the implementation of these ideas. And cultural touchstones are really important. And so I think it's important to differentiate between transitory ideas and fads and these enduring cultural touchstones. And finally, in work I'm working on now, I think that, and this is also in the World Politics article, culture really, I think, provides the continuity in institutional change. So we talk about a lot about policy legacies, and I think policy legacies are important, although, as people have pointed out, they can work either way. Well, culture tends to kind of encourage us to move in certain directions when we decide to rework our institutional solutions and policy reforms. And so I think it's important to kind of look at some of these enduring cultural touchstones and the way that people manipulate symbols to do that. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you so much to Kathy Jo for organizing the panel, and to our discussants and all of you for being here. This project that I'm presenting today is part of a larger book manuscript with Gwyneth McClendon looking at the role of religious messages in particular on political participation. And today I want to help us kind of dive into the role of culture more generally by starting with the puzzle of political participation. We know that political science literature for decades has discussed the puzzle, really, of political participation. Why do people participate? Why do people go out into the streets? Why do they go to vote when it may or may not matter for the final outcome? Why do people take particular types of action, either critical of the status quo or potentially participate in ways that are enhancing and maintaining the status quo power structures? And the way that we approach this question, this puzzle, is to say that religious teachings, in particular, religious teachings received through sermons, explain important differences and divergences in the forms of political participation and the quantity of political participation that citizens undertake. Because sermons themselves and religious messages are sources of metaphysical instruction. They help inform citizens' understanding of how the world works around them, and very importantly, their place in it. Religious sermons also help tackle questions about causes of problems in this world. Where do problems emanate from? What possibilities for change are even possible in this world, and about the nature of human agency. Are you, as an individual agent of God, capable of undertaking change in the world around you? Sermons also shape listeners' views about what needs to change to improve governance and citizen welfare, and whether that individual action is likely to be efficacious. So for all of these reasons, sermons can be a very powerful way of shaping how individuals see the world around them and their role in it. And as Kathy Jo mentioned, there are certainly challenges to studying the effects of culture writ large. First of all, culture is not monolithic. We might try to identify particular types of culture. And these attempts generally lead us to some forms of essentialism, as Kathy Jo mentioned, that it can be very difficult to narrow in on what matters about cultural influences without having a kind of monolithic approach. And another reason why studying culture is challenging is because people can, to some degree, select into exposure to cultural influences. They can choose whether or not they go to a particular place of religious worship. So they can choose the frequency of their exposure to some extent. They can choose perhaps the type of religious institution they go to, searching out a type of pastor or imam or cleric who will teach something that they may be seeking, who already confirms or builds upon the type of messages they're seeking out. Or in Kathy Jo's experience, they might try to be interested in certain types of literature and pick up certain types of novels that are circulating in the broader public and be less interested in others. So these are all challenges to how we think about the particular effects that culture might have. And so one solution that we propose in this project is to disaggregate cultural systems into the particular component parts so that we can look at and carefully describe their meaning in a particular time and place and context, and not to have a kind of idea that's free-floating in which we impose some value upon it that's not actually meaningful in the context in which it's interpreted. and that this disaggregation can allow parts to be mutable. Therefore, it can allow us to change certain components of cultural exposure and therefore examine actual causal effects. So our focus in this project is really on one element of religion, disaggregating culture down to the role of sermons in particular. And why do we disaggregate this way in sub-Saharan Africa? In particular, we choose to focus on sermons because there's often little variation across the region in the degree to which people identify as religious. This is a Afrobarometer survey of the degree to which people respond that religion is very important, and well over the vast majority of the population, 90%, will say religion is very important in their lives. And this gives people access to religious networks, access to religious resources. So we see little variation on that front. So we don't want to divide people into believers and non-believers if that doesn't give us a lot of leverage into the role of culture. Also, religion is not a highly politicized identity. It's not a cleavage around which people are separating into political parties in many cases. And finally, there's substantial variation in the teachings and content. There's significant differences in the content of religious sermons, and therefore we can use that to look at real-life examples of different types of messages that are circulating in the public milieu. So before testing what are the causal effects of these different types of religious teaching, we needed to be able to have a very strong empirical grasp of what the content of actual sermons are. So we were working in Nairobi, and this is a map of our Google Earth religious church sampling. We started in Nairobi in particular because of its religious, ethnic, and socioeconomic diversity, that we thought this would be a place where we would be able to see different types of people exposed to a number of different messages. And then we randomly sampled churches in Nairobi from Google Earth using a variety of different search mechanisms, Pentecostal, Evangelical, Anglican, Lutheran, all of the above, to focus on Christian services so that we could compare across one content area. And then we visited services at each church twice, both during non-electoral periods and during the lead up to the 2017 highly contested elections, so that we could see, was there variation in the messages over time during highly politicized periods in the country. These general findings were about sermon content were that it was very rare for a sermon to be explicitly political. People would pray for peace, people would pray for the goodwill of the country, but there was not a particular political ideology or partisan bent to sermons. And sermons discussed broadly similar types of problems: poverty, inequality, conflict. But sermons differed dramatically in their portrayal of how the world works. So the way in which we found that sermon content varied most dramatically was between types of churches that self-identified as Pentecostal versus those that self-identified as mainline Protestant and Catholic. So those that were Pentecostal located the sources of earthly problems that we face in our day-to-day, inside the individual, in the character, in the strength of faith that one holds within them. In contrast, the mainline Protestant and Catholic located the sources of earthly problems outside of the individual, in relationships within the world, in structures, in institutions, in things that can be approached vis-a-vis the political context. The Pentecostal sermons also differed in the way they empowered the citizens who were listening and focused on leaders' characteristics. They said that individuals could have a role in making change in this world, and therefore that we should ask each leader to make positive change within themselves and therefore within the country. In contrast, the mainline Protestant and Catholic sermons were reluctant and focused on structural reform, that change is difficult because you have to change all of these structures. We took these sermons to the lab. We ran over 1,000 Christian adults to participate, and then we randomly assigned these Christian adults to recordings of both the Pentecostal and the mainline sermons, and then we gave them opportunities to play different types of participation games and report on their political efficacy, how much they felt enabled or efficacious to participate in politics, and also to participate in a text messaging campaign. So from this variety of different exposures across the lab assessments, we found that exposure to the Pentecostal sermons increased political efficacy, that they oriented people toward criticism of individual leaders' strength and faith, and leadership development opportunities, and intrinsic incentives for good governance. So this is an approach that doesn't leave people sitting at home and making them kind of isolated individuals, but that pushes people into the public arena and voicing their own power and capacity to engage, but in doing so, reestablishes and re-empowers the structural context as it is, and asks individuals instead to change. In contrast, exposure to the mainline and Catholic sermon decreased political efficacy, but where it did push people was to undertake criticism of institutions and laws, asking for legislative changes, and focusing on extrinsic incentives for good governance. So we suggest that this exposure to Pentecostal sermons generates a kind of empowered seekers of leadership change, whereas exposure to the mainline or Catholic sermons generates a kind of reluctant seekers of structural change, recognizing one's own limited capacity to engender that change. So one other interesting question in looking across Pew surveys and Afrobarometer, what are the duration effects? How likely is this kind of exposure to sermons to last for long periods? And we surprisingly found that the duration effects are quite short-lived. And I think this is a great, from Riverside Church in New York City, this parishioner says, me, one after church, I am an instrument for the love of God, me no later than 48 hours later. Well, that's whatever, we're at it again. And the pastor replies, it's what keeps us all coming back. And if you think about it, religious institutions are organized around the need and the necessity for frequent exposure. Read the Bible, read the Quran, practice, come together, be a part of this community continually to reinforce the message and to limit the influences of all of the competing alternative ideologies and ideas that are coming at us from various sources. So we found this effect in the survey data, that on Mondays, after the kind of Sunday exposure, those who report going to church only once in the week have a significant difference between Pentecostals and mainline Catholics in their reported political self-efficacy, whereas that converges later in the week after exposure to all of these other influences. Whereas those who report going to midweek worshiping, we see another bump on Friday, that, kind of after this midweek exposure, again, Pentecostals are feeling more political self-efficacy. So what does this suggest for our study of culture and cultural influences? First, I think we want to propose that disaggregating in this way, disaggregating our approach to culture into particular component parts that we can identify and, importantly, contextualize, can be analytically useful. So we understand what the meaning of the content is in particular times and places. Focusing on sermons in particular allows us to describe this religious content in its situation, in its environment, and examine the causal effects of religious content on political behavior without assuming any official doctrine, any particular set of beliefs, or the receptivity of the laity who receive the messages. And it also allows us to pay attention to short-term fluctuations in religious and cultural influences more generally, not taking longevity of cultural influence for granted. So thank you very much.
So we go from the short-term fluctuations to the very long-term non-fluctuations, in my case. Aspects of culture that not only don't vary week on week, but decade on decade or century on century. I'm looking at the durability of national identities and national loyalties more broadly. And over the past 30 to 40 years, a consensus has emerged about national identity, and identity more broadly, ethnic and national identities. And that consensus suggests that those identities are fluid, that they change, and it's a legitimate pushback against more essentialist or primordialist accounts that see identities as in sort of herited traits. It's also a pushback against the sort of Allman and Verba political culture arguments of the 1960s, which focused on socialization, child rearing, all sorts of things. And again, we're focused on profound continuities rather than flexibility and change. It's also often argued that identities are highly situational, that you shift your identity based on context, and in particular, based on the instrumental incentives of different contexts. So if in one context it serves me to identify as French, I'll identify as French. In another, if it serves, let's say I can be European or German, I might shift my identity over time, or at least induce my children to shift their identity over time. And there's a strong intellectual basis for this. There's lots of good scholarship that shows how identities are in some cases contingent, fluid, and instrumentally selected. Bates and Layton have focused on Africa, and some of this sort of seminal work on this from the 1980s, drawing in part on Abner Cohen's work also on Africa from the late 1970s. Jim Scott makes these arguments about the Southeast Asian highlands, right? He argues that identities are, quote, porous, plural, and in flux, with individuals performing ethnicity in order to achieve status or material benefit in roles that are situationally cued. Kanchan Chandra, in addition to making major contributions to this literature, has done a nice summary of the literature, arguing essentially that there's a new conventional wisdom, which is that identities are fluid and instrumentally selected, that people hold them lightly. Right? Dan Posner, I could add many to this list. Lisa Wedeen, focusing on the Arab world in Peripheral Visions, has also argued that identities are fluid. And I quote, she says, national solidarities can happen episodically, be conveyed anonymously, and solidify suddenly, only to collapse once again in apathy and discord. And she refers to the vague, mildly constraining form of national identification. I study parts of the world where national identification is not mildly constraining or vague. And I think part of the problem with the constructivist consensus is that it's mostly derived from a few parts of the world where national identity has not been constructed, where there has been no effective nation-building project on the part of states. So if we look, this is just a map of literacy rates by country, which we can kind of use as a proxy for education. And if we think that national identity can be introduced through schools, through that form of socialization, which is what I'll argue in a second, this would be a good indicator of the extent to which you have the cultivation of national identity. And if we look at this, Chandra's work on South Asia, Paul Brass, also on South Asia, all of the work on Africanists, they're really selecting from parts of the world which have not been exposed to mass education and schooling and haven't been exposed to nation-building projects. So it's not terribly surprising that in these contexts, we would not find powerful forms of durable national identities, right? These are not areas in which those identities have been built. In work with Harris Milonis, we've argued that the threat of external threats to territory induce states to engage in nation building through education. And sub-Saharan Africa, because of international treaties, have fixed borders. So the external threats are relatively light. And here you can see, this is a table from our 2016 CPS piece, right at the bottom. The percentage of the population that speaks the dominant language is less than 50% in sub-Saharan Africa. Similar, very close in South Asia. It's also quite low in Southeast Asia. In other words, these are areas where you haven't had the construction of identities in the way that you have had in Europe, East Asia, and Latin America. So, how do you create durable nationalisms? The older tradition focused on socialization. And I know this is a panel on new approaches to culture, but I actually think we need to turn back to some of the older approaches to culture while shedding some of its unfortunate baggage. And the argument that I make in a book manuscript of which this is, from which this is drawn is that the initial schooling creates national loyalties. In other words, when you take illiterate populations that identify based on personal ties and personal relationships, that don't have broad sets of attachments. You school them to identify as German, Frenchmen, Ukrainians, etc. That creates these national loyalties. Where that doesn't happen, you don't get national loyalties. It gets preserved, however, over time within families. That parents tend to want to promote the national identity that they have in their own children, and that primary socialization in the home takes over from the school once populations have a national identity and they've been schooled. And this creates profound continuities. Because even if you change the school curriculum, even if the territory comes to be occupied by a different sovereign power that tries to change those identities, parents, families, communities will push back and resist. And so to test this argument, you really only need to know two things. You need to know when populations were schooled, right? So what, if you're looking at a given territory, a given community, even a given family, when they were schooled, and what was the content of that schooling, in particular the national content. And I focus on two components of national content. One is the basic identity category. In other words, what category is that population placed in? Are they Hungarians, Ukrainians, Russians, Malay, Kachin, et cetera? And the other is the story, the sort of what Roger Smith calls the constitutive story, which is basically giving meaning to that, talking about why that is your identity and who your rivals are, who your political enemies are. And that typically comes in history and geography texts. And today I'm just going to present a couple of subnational cases to try to make the case that once these identities are constructed through schools, they persist in families and they're quite durable. Two cases in particular. I'm going to look at Alsace and Lorraine, which were in between the years of 1871 and 1918. These were French provinces after 1648. So the Peace of Westphalia assigns these to France from the Holy Roman Empire. And over the course of the next 200 years before they're annexed by the Germans, these are highly educated provinces, some of the most educated provinces in France. 91% of brides and 96% of grooms could sign their names in 1865. The curriculum in these areas told these people that they were French and cultivated a French identity, but it did so in the German language. So linguistically, they're German speakers, but they're French identified. It's annexed by Germany from France with the creation of the German state after the Franco-Prussian War. And the population, only 15% of the population spoke French, but you would imagine from an instrumental perspective that these territories annexed by the Germans would have an easy time assimilating. In other words, they're already German-speaking, but they don't identify with France. So they have various responses to German annexation. First, out of a population of 1.2 million, 400,000 leave, and they leave for French territory. So you have a massive exit of the population. Of those who remain, there's widespread refusal to serve in the army and desertion once they're in the army. During the First World War, German High Command stationed most Alsatian soldiers on the Eastern Front and refused them furloughs because they were afraid that they would fight for the French if they were anywhere else. And during the period of German occupation, they vote consistently for parties that reject the annexation of Alsace and Lorraine. So this is from the paper, but you can see that seats won by parties rejecting the annexation of Alsace-Lorraine are a majority in every Reichstag election that was held between 1871 and 1918. Okay, I have 4 minutes left, so I'm going to very briefly look at another case. The problem with Alsace and Lorraine, it's a very good case for looking at variation over time, but we don't have a control case. We don't have a comparison of a let's say, a province that was German identified and German speaking that was annexed that would allow us to give a nice comparison to show the durability of identity. In Ukraine, we have this. I look at two Ukrainian provinces, Transcarpathia and Stanislavov, now called Ivano-Frankivsk, over a century. The initial schooling of these territories varied. The populations were virtually identical to one another before education was introduced to these populations. They spoke the same language. They were the same percentage of the overall population. They had the same religion. They were both poor, rural areas, primarily engaged in farming. But different national identities were cultivated because different powers controlled the schools. And so in Transcarpathia, the schools were run by essentially Russophiles who told these people that they were part of the broader people of Rus, the same as the people that existed in Greater Russia. In Stanislavov or in Ivano-Frankivsk, these people were told that they were Ukrainians and that their historic enemies were the Russians and the Poles, that they were physically, racially, and nationally distinct from both the Russians and the Poles. 2 minutes. Okay. As a result, over time, over the next 100 years, we see significant differences in how these two populations behave. When the Soviets occupied these territories after the Second World War, the populations of Stanislavov or Ivano-Frankivsk that were Ukrainian identified resist. They form an underground insurgency in this particular province with over 20,000 men under arms that fight the Soviets into the 1950s, whereas the Soviets are welcomed in as liberators of the population in Transcarpathia. In the 1980s, in Stanislavov or Ivano-Frankivsk, this is the hotbed of the protest movement, both in this region and moving to Kiev to sort of push for broader Ukrainian independence. There's very little protest activity in Transcarpathia, and much of it is pro-Soviet. If you look at contemporary voting, so since free elections have been held, from 1989 on, you get voting for pro-Russian candidates and pro-Russian parties in Transcarpathia, and for Ukrainian nationalist candidates and anti-Russian pro-NATO parties in Stanislavov or Ivano-Frankivsk. So I'll skip through some of the details of that and just jump to my conclusions. Initial schooling in most of the world, where it has been tried, creates durable national loyalties. And we see this in world values surveys. We see it in these micro-level case studies that make up the core of my book. And we see it basically in wherever it has been tried. This suggests that national identity is in fact a product of socialization, not instrumental selection. It's not one element of a toolkit that people take off the shelf. It is a deep and powerful button that gets pushed. And we see it getting pushed in a number of key episodes over the last century in Europe and Eurasia. We have, some of the leading work on this is being done by Leonid Pesachin on socialization, looking at families and communities. And there's a panel tomorrow that I strongly encourage you guys to attend, where his paper is presented. Finally, national identity is more transcendent than current constructivist accounts suggest. The idea that it's always situational, in other words, how we identify as a function of a given context, doesn't seem to apply in most cases of national identity. We have tremendous changes in context over the course of 100 years in Eurasia. The identities are largely stable across that, and they have predictable consequences on behavior during that period of time. And finally, identities are just much more consequential than current accounts suggest. These are not lightly held. They drive behavior. They motivate people to kill and die, to make considerable sacrifices. We see this in most parts of the world, and it's something that we ignore at our peril. Thank you.
Both myself and Kate McNamara can comment. I am going to start and try to be relatively quick. So I think the very fact that we're having this panel is a very interesting sign. There was a time, I guess actually fairly long ago, since I've been at this for a long time, when people didn't take culture or ideational variables very seriously. And for the most part, two reasons were advanced for this. One was a kind of more general epistemological kind of critique, that is to say that we could understand political behavior and political outcomes without reference to people's ideas or deeply held beliefs, that they were motivated by something else, whether it was material or they were rational calculators and you could read their behavior off the context that they were in. We didn't really need to know anything about sort of beliefs, about culture or religion, because in fact they were not the primary motivators of behavior. The second type of critique that was forwarded against these kinds of approaches was a more practical critique. Well, maybe it's true that things like culture and religion or national identity matter, but they're impossible to study. They're too amorphous. They're not subject to empirical verification. We can't use sophisticated methodologies to study them. And I think what's really interesting in what this panel reflects is that, in fact, we've gone past, to a large degree, both of those kinds of critiques or objections. The first one, I think, the more epistemological critique, right, the critique about what was actually driving political behavior and political outcomes, I think has been largely obviated to some degree by world events, right? As Keith has said just recently, and as some of the other panelists have mentioned, it's very hard these days to study political science and not think about things like identity or religion or people's particular views of the world when trying to explain why they do what they do or why we have the different outcomes that we have. But the second thing I think is equally interesting because, in fact, they feed back upon each other, which is it's now impossible to say that you are not able as a social scientist to study these kinds of variables without the kind of rigor that people expect from our analyses. And so I'm going to offer now a few comments on Rachel's paper, or rather Rachel and Gwen's paper, but I'll say Rachel since she was the one who presented it, that I think sort of reflects very well how much this literature has advanced and become, in the best sense of the word, mainstream, right? Sort of that sounds pejorative in a lot of ways, but I don't think in this case it is. So, Rachel's paper, exemplifying, I think, how you can study something like religion or beliefs or whatever rigorously and with a variety of methodologies and approaches. Okay, so she's interested, as you saw, about how religion influences political behavior. And they operationalize, Rachel and Gwyneth, in this paper, religion simply as one, albeit particularly powerful, source of information about how the world does and should work. Right? If you want to understand why people participate in politics, then you need to understand that kind of thing. And you need to understand, again, what they view as the problems of politics are and what they view as the potential solutions to them. Now, again, what's really crucial here, I think, is that what they're saying is that the reasons for participation are not simply about the environment. They're about the ideas that people have in their head about the environment and how to respond to them, about what is appropriate, desirable, possible, yada, yada, yada. There is no, in other words, direct translation between what's going on in the political world and political behavior. It has to be filtered through the ideas people have about that world that lay in their head, the interpretive maps, as they put it in the nicer jargon in the paper. So the paper, I think, advances this literature in a variety of ways that have to do with practical study of culture. First, it avoids the pitfall of self-selection. This is very prominent in the ideational literature, right? You don't want people to be picking their groups, religious groups, identity groups, based on pre-existing qualities, right? Because then the culture or the religion or the national identity is epiphenomenal of something deeper. The way they structure this paper helps to avoid that pitfall. I think that is really an important thing to focus on. Second, they show the causal impact of religion through a variety of different methodologies. One, experiments. Again, I find those a little worrisome because I think, again, not only are they short-term, as Rachel herself pointed out, the impact that is, but also they're a little artificial. But what's nice about this paper, right, is that it pairs these experiments with other kinds of data and approaches, right? And so therefore, the more methodologies we use, the more confident we can be that the proposed variable, different types of religion, actually matter. Really helpful. Also, religion is just one, again, albeit particularly important, influence on political behavior, right? Religion in this paper is nothing special, right? In fact, when I was reading it, I ended up seeing religion almost as propaganda or advertising, right? Here's some lessons for you about, what you should be concerned about what the problems are and how you can deal with them. It wasn't done directly, but it was the same kind of idea. Let's take this big amorphous variable, something that political scientists may be a little hesitant to study, religion, right? And let's think about it the way we would any kind of thing that's trying to influence people's views of the world. I think that actually gave them a lot of leverage on the study of it. Okay, also really important. This allows them, this kind of approach, to define religion in a way that is empirically tractable, right? Someone is a Christian, someone is Jewish, someone is Muslim. That is so broad and amorphous that it seems very difficult as a social scientist for us to trace the impact of that on this. But the way Rachel and Gwyneth do it, by breaking down these traditions, by looking carefully at the content of the sermons, means that when we say someone is Pentecostal, we have something, again, very empirically verifiable and causally traceable to analyze. That is really helpful, and that is the way I think the literature is going to go forward. Also, again, not seeing religion or cultural variables, as I think many analysts previously have done, as something almost structural or essentialist, right? Which is to say, it's unchanging, it's incredibly broad, it affects everyone in the same way. That makes it a hammer, right? And when you have a hammer, everything is a nail, and therefore causal significance is very difficult to prove. The way it's treated in this paper means that we can, in fact, see both what it is and the mechanisms by which it might influence outcomes. And I will stop there. And my last comment is that I think the more we carefully study culture, ideational variables, religion, national identities in this rigorous way, not only do we advance the cause of practically studying them, that is to say, understanding both what their origins are and what their impacts are, but it feeds back, I think, into the larger epistemological divides within the discipline. If we can study something, we will see that it matters, right? Again, it's the sort of obverse of the analogy about the drunk looking for his or her keys under the lamppost, right? You look for them there because that's where the light is. The broader our ability to study and understand these things, the more likely I think we will be able to recognize how powerfully they impact political behavior and political outcomes. And so I applaud, actually, all of you for your rigorous study of these things, because I think it will help us, again, broaden our vision as social scientists. Thank you.
I have a lot to say, so I'll try to be quick, but thank you for inviting me to be on this panel. It was really such a pleasure to read these papers, and I really agree with pretty much everything Sherry said. She and I have been at this for quite a long time, and it's really exciting to see sort of how far the study of ideas, norms, and culture has moved forward. So my plan is to talk a little bit about why culture is important to study and how I sort of think about it, and then how these papers help with that, and then I'm going to give specific feedback on the two other papers. So why is culture important to study? You're all here, so you must think it's important, but I think it's good to sort of lay out how we're thinking about culture, and particularly in interacting with these papers. This moment, as Sherry sort of indicated, clearly we need to think about that there's a new recognition of the need for understanding how material and social logics work in politics, right? That it's no longer enough to just think about the material side. But at the same time, I think we're clearly moving beyond the sort of early literature on ideas, which really thought about ideas as sort of singular properties of actors, right? They attach to individuals. To think about culture as this relatively stable set of social structures that we all are within, right? We have multiple overlapping cultures that we exist within, and that these cultures are really made up of both representation and symbols and ideas, but also practices, right? And that this is consequential because they profoundly shape the way we see the world, right? And so we need to think about that, because that's where the sort of meaning making comes in that helps us form our preferences, and the sort of how we make sense of the world around us is in part fed by those cultures that we exist within, right? And I should note that even though these papers actually focus on what we consider, traditionally think of as culture, like religion, literature, nationalism, I would also remind us that, of course, our cultures don't stop sort of at the kind of, normal kind of cultural product door, but they, in fact, are also found in things like markets, in scientific communities, among foreign policymakers, right? So we, often in the past, people sort of divided up the places where culture mattered, and it was in these sort of soft areas. And I would insist very firmly that, of course, if we believe that these things are profoundly affecting the way human beings think about the world, the way our political preferences are formed, we also have to extend that sort of beyond these traditional senses. So we have these structures, and I said they were relatively stable social structures that we exist within, and that we as actors exist within. But of course, what's so fascinating to study is that these are social structures that only occur because of us, through our agency as actors, sort of remaking them on a daily basis, right? They have to be regenerated by our social interactions over time, and so that means that they're inherently dynamic. And that's really hard to study, right? The notion that these are stable things, and yet there's always this possibility for change over time, right? But it also means there are lots and lots of really interesting questions about when do people's identities change? When do they change from being somebody in the Périgord who thinks of himself in terms of, this peasant of France, right, to being a Frenchman, right? How do these things change? And so I think that all of these papers really start to sort of grasp and grapple with all these things. And these papers also really are fantastic for avoiding this sort of overly generalized, kind of overly deterministic, poorly theorized, poorly empirically applied sort of early versions of culture, just as Sherry said. So these papers really are exciting examples of the varied ways that we might theorize and study how culture matters as a causal variable, right? Making very precise how to slice in to these big things, big phenomena that we know are important, and really isolate what's going on. So for example, we have with Rachel's paper, thinking about how culture is key in producing outcomes of political behavior and political action, right, by looking at sermons and so on. We have culture as shaping the outcome of welfare state policies in Kathy and Tom's paper, right, and looking at specifically at literature and how literature is a cultural artifact that both reflects underlying norms and also may shape outcomes themselves. And then, of course, with Keith's paper, culture is a key foundational factor through socialization within educational settings that then profoundly and durably shapes subsequent generations' sense of national identity. So the three papers really bring also an array of mixed methods approaches to this causal identification, historical qualitative, fieldwork, textual analysis experiments, and so on. So go read these papers, creative and innovative, asking big questions, using precise empirics to answer them. So let me have a few specific comments now to Kathy, Jo, and to Keith. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the framing of the paper, the argument, the evidence, and then just sort of throw out some suggestions. So for Kathy's paper, I think the frame of the paper is excellent. They really set it up as this is a really important empirical question. There's a gap in the literature. People don't truly understand the very important variations in the content of different welfare state policies. And so we need to look at that. I would point you, Kathy, to, I don't know if you know the work of Frank Dobbin in Forging Industrial Policy, where a very, very early account where he looks at very similarly, right, at cross-national variation around industrial policy towards railroads, US, Britain, France, and I think, offers a really nice way of thinking about that. The argument that they offer is also very persuasive and compelling. This cultural toolkit, emotional or affective role of literature and then authors as activists, I think is very persuasive. But there I would argue that I would want you to continue to probe the sort of reciprocal causality at work, right, in terms of what is literature really doing. And that leads me to your empirics. It's amazing the work you do in terms of finding patterns in the text which reflect the different variations in these underlying cultural values and how that then translates and correlates with the welfare states. And I think all of the choices that you make in terms of choosing your words and so on are all fantastic. My question is whether the qualitative analysis does as much for the paper as the quantitative does. And you're going to hate me for this, because the qualitative analysis is clearly, you've gone and read so much stuff and so on. But I want to offer an idea, if not in this paper, in a subsequent paper. I wonder if you could actually, instead of sort of surveying lots and lots of different works, you could zero in on a couple significant works in the different countries and sort of really focus in on how those works, something like Dickens' Oliver Twist, actually impact mass public's understandings. What is the conversation around these literatures and texts as they come out? Is it a mass public thing? Does it become sort of buzzwords amongst the elites, right? How do we actually see these literatures becoming consequential in terms of shaping the way people are thinking about what are the problems we face as a society, how are we going to fix those things, right? So instead of sort of looking at the big patterns, which is what the qualitative stuff does, similar to the quantitative, I wonder if you would slice in more. Yeah, okay, good. All right. Implications and further thoughts, questions that I have. One is, what do you think about novels and literature versus film, media, YouTube, music? I was sort of thinking about, in today's cultural environment, what are the things that are standing out? Is it Kendrick Lamar or Childish Gambino, right, rapping about race relations? Is it, all the different types of movies that are now coming out about the state of the world that we're in and so on? And those clearly probably have effective differences than literature. Just curious about that. I also want to know about how the US fits into your typology, if we have time. All right, I'll turn to Keith finally, and this is very near and dear to my heart because these are the types of issues I've been thinking about a lot in terms of the European Union and thinking about national identities and a European identity. This paper also really exciting and really innovative. I would say, turning to the question of how the paper is framed, I would actually suggest you frame it somewhat differently. I think I was very uncomfortable with sort of lumping in lots of people to these constructivists who see these national identities as inherently, constantly fluid and able to be easily changed. And I guess when I got to the page where we were talking about like Leighton and Bates in terms of constructivism, then I was like, no, those aren't our guys. They're not constructivists, right? Because they have that instrumental view, right? And I think that you don't need to pick that fight. That you actually have something so much cooler going on in this paper, which is this question of when and why are national identities robust or not, right? And I take your point that people probably went too far towards it's fluid and constructed. But, when I think about constructivism as sort of Berger and Luckman and so on, I really see stable social structures, things like marriage, things like, American football, right? The things they talk about in the book, in Berger and Luckman's book, right? And so to me, that really just sort of rang the alarm bells, I guess. The theory itself, I think, is incredibly sort of persuasive and intuitive, and I really look forward to the book because I think you had to kind of crunch a bunch of things into the paper. And I would throw out a few questions to you as well. Time, 2 minutes, okay. How are these feelings of this imagined community built and disrupted, right? Not that we assume they're going to be easily changed, but sort of what are the things that might disrupt them? And the story that you tell, which is very persuasive to me, is really one about the sort of overwhelming cultural technology that came along with the rise of the nation state, right? That this is an incredible kind of political project that we've, on the scale of which we've never seen, right? So something like an imagined community is built on feelings of connection that previously would only be in that small little village in Bergerac or wherever, right? And so the nation state is this, example of modernity and the consolidation of administrative capacity and authority that's very hard won over time, right? But once it's there, then is quite robust. And I think we are at this point in the world where a lot of us are struggling to think about, and me as an EU scholar, well, is there anything beyond the nation state, right? Historically, we've seen new emergent forms of political authority. The nation state is just this one little blip in historical time, but boy, it seems, as you say, very, very stable, right? So helping us zero in on, the role of the education, which only becomes because of that administrative capacity, and then I think building out the family stuff will help us understand that much, much more. And my last question to you is explain the Catalans to me, okay? All right. That'll take a while. Thank you very much.
Does anybody want to start with some questions, or we can have our panelists respond to some of the prompts that are already there, but we'd like to give you guys a chance to get involved in the conversation if you would like to. Hands? Yeah. Okay, why don't, I mean, probably you can just get up and scream, but if you want to use the mic, go ahead. Yes, we can hear you fine.
Can you say your name, though, please?
My name is Sergei Isakov. I was curious, this is something that I'm struggling with in my own work. What is culture? I mean, one of the tricky things about this literature back in the 60s and 70s is that it's
why don't we, yeah, do you want to take a bunch or do you want to just, okay, all right, do we have others? Yes, Boo.
If you, from a policy perspective, try to explain variation in corrupt behavior based on culture, and I can say anthropology is used to excuse corruption based on culture. Now we have a number of economists, Paul Collier and others, who blame corruption on culture. The problem from a policy perspective, if you go to, say, Nigeria and say, your culture is corrupt, it's not very far from saying you are corrupt people, you are bad people. That's not a very good start for a policy change, right? And the data doesn't come in very handy. The Afrobarometer, and some of you know this, say that people all over the world, especially in highly corrupt African countries, take actually a moral stand against corruption. So I wonder, and I've tried to handle this in the following way, based on work by some philosophers, Brennan and others, in a book explaining norms. They say there are two types of norms. One is moral norms that tell you what is right and wrong. But then they say there is another type of norms, norms as social practice. So this is how we do things here. This is our standard operating procedure. Take an example. You're ill. You're in a corrupt country. You get terrified what to do. And you ask, where should I go? And the people at the hotel say, well, it's not a problem. We have a modernly equipped healthcare clinic here, 500 meters away. But they say, now you are in our country X, and here is the standard operating procedure is you put an envelope with $100 on the doctor's table. Now, what do? Most people would actually do it, right? But that doesn't mean that they think it's morally okay. So I wonder if I think your concept of culture is a little too broad because it doesn't distinguish between moral norms and norms as standard operating procedures. And these are quite, from a policy perspective, this is, as you can imagine, quite important.
On the Catalans, just go down the hall and talk to Laia Balcells, your new colleague. She has a nice article that looks at the construction of Catalan identity through the schools and how it persists over time. So you would agree with her? Yeah. Okay. She wrote that for my seminar on nationalism and identity many years ago. What is culture? And both these questions are really kind of on this question. And like Rachel, I find it very useful not to talk about culture itself, but to disaggregate it into the specific things I'm talking about on the assumption that these things operate differently. They have very different causal properties. And so we just need to, if you go back to discussions of culture in the 19th century, it's really everything that's not nature, right? So it's incredibly broad, right? Including standard operating procedures, practices. From my own view, I kind of take what Kate was suggesting, coming out of the similar ideational tradition in IR, which is culture is shared ideas, right? But I recognize that even that is far too broad, that causal ideas like science change much more rapidly than things like identity. And so I think that I want to talk about identity and some of the political loyalties that get associated with identity, and that will have very different properties than something related to corruption or even to political participation, right? So, let alone the welfare state. Although I think the relation to the welfare state, I feel much more affinity with the argument that Kathy Jo is making. There are similarities there. Yeah, so there's this whole Bourdieu thing of practices. I don't find that very useful. It's more descriptive of what people are doing for the reasons exactly that you identify. I'll leave it at that.
Can I just really quickly, I like Bourdieu. The Politics of Everyday Europe, my last book, uses very much the notion of culture is in part the taken for granted background that no one actually really immediately thinks about. So it's much more your second category, actually.
Great, thank you so much. These are great questions. And I think in the way that Keith was suggesting, actually disaggregating culture actually helps us really look at this particular question that Boo is suggesting, in that We might have a general definition of what culture is, but that it works in very different ways. So in the religious, role of ideas and religious ideas, this is exactly where the duration question becomes very important, because you go and you're exposed to these ideas that reinforce, let's say, the moral norms, and are pushing you to see yourself in the world in a particular way. And then you leave those doors and you're confronted by alternative realities that might push you towards the kinds of norms of standing and operating practice. And so these are, as Kate suggested in her comments, we're embedded within multiple worlds, and how this kind of the sense of how your own touchstones or how that shapes preferences, I think is very different according to these disaggregated components, and how frequently they're reinforced by the world around you, and how frequently they're kind of torn down or need to be revamped.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with Rachel in terms of thinking about the moral norms. And I think we have to start disaggregating some of these concepts, and I think that's what all of us are struggling to do. So when I think about moral norms, they're closely related to some of the questions about welfare states. There's a question about who is responsible for your moral behavior. And we know that some countries are organized vertically, some countries are organized horizontally. This we've learned from people like Bob Putnam and some people who've worked on Asia. And so if you look at norms of behavior in Japan, for example, there are a lot of expectations about how you treat people in your family, and there are very, very strong obligations, very strong sense of community within families. But you go out on the streets and people just litter like crazy. At least they used to. I think they're getting a little better at it, because they don't really have a sense of society as deserving their certain kinds of behaviors. So I think very much that these questions about what does corruption even mean? You have to look at who are the beneficiaries of your particular obligations. So I think it would be really interesting to kind of look at that in greater detail in the literature. I just want to say a few things in response. First of all, thank you so much to Sherry and Kate for doing this. I actually invited Kate and Sherry because they've done really path-breaking work in this field, and in my own work, I think I cite them like every other line or something. They're just phenomenal. They've done phenomenal work, and it's been super important, and so we're really lucky to get them today. On the qualitative part, thanks, Kate, for that. This is a spin-off paper on a much larger book project on literature and education reform. And one large part of the paper is to trace the networks of authors and policymakers in Britain and Denmark at these critical junctures over a couple hundred years. And so I've actually spent the summer in the mid-19th century, which is a great escape from Donald Trump, by the way. I just have to say that. And so it's been fascinating to think of these authors as activists in policy areas, but that's only one part of the thing they do. I've also tried to look at how the literary constructions have some impact on the political debates. And so I've gotten Hansard full text, and I'm trying to look at like the kind of comparisons of topic modeling in the literature and topic modeling in the parliamentary debates. And I'm waiting for the Danish Folketinget to be digitalized, which is happening at any moment. So I'm definitely, and then the final thing is I spent a lot of time in the other paper in the book project looking at these kind of 8 key works in the paper. And in this one, I decided rather than doing 8 key novels, I would take snippets and I did it like kind of randomly selected snippets. So maybe I should go back, though, to the other model. In terms of implications for literature today, so my work stops in the 1920s because I'm really interested in the early impacts of literature. I think today it's really different because authors just don't have the same kind of impact on our thinking when you kind of add up TV and the internet. And I mean, for my 20-year-old son, Reddit sites tragically have much more impact on the way he thinks about the world than Jane Austen. I think it's a mistake, but I'm not going to go there. So I think there's an interesting dynamic at play of how globalization has opened up our views of what are appropriate kinds of solutions. Now that said, what I've observed that's kind of interesting is that countries are influenced by global ideas and global exchange of ideas, and they create solutions that they're not entirely comfortable with. So Denmark right now in education, has gone down this line of trying to respond to PISA demands, to have greater assessment, to move away from the learning by doing, and train each individual to play his or her role in society. They had a very different kind of education system historically. They've moved away from that in response to international pressures, and they're now going back to it. And so there's a big debate about if they've lost that essential Danishness, which I think is very connected to these deep underlying views of culture. And I just also want to say that I think looking at the way that cultural purveyors of cultural artifacts recombine symbols and narratives for new challenges is a particularly fruitful way of approaching culture in a more disaggregated way. So you're not talking about culture with a big C. And so that's what I've been trying to do in this work. I think it's an interesting question of where these cultural symbols come from. And in my studies of Denmark and Britain, I think the Danes routinely kind of refer to the old Nordic myths. These are really deep-seated ideas. The Brits refer to Greek and Roman ideology and myths. And so you have Matthew Arnold talking about Hellenic the ideals and sweetness and light of the individual. And so it's a really, really different cultural touch point. The final question, where does the U.S. fit into the typology? I'm planning on building an American corpus. I also just want to acknowledge that Eric Olson is in the audience. He helped me build the Swedish corpus and is doing work with me. So thanks to him. So thank you so much.
All right, well, we are at 11:29, so I just want to thank all our panelists, including my great commentator here, for some really interesting conversation, and for all of you coming, and hopefully these conversations will continue. Thanks so much.